My name is Vasina, and for years my uncle treated me like the one person in the family who didn't matter. He dismissed me, talked over me, and made sure everyone saw me as the quiet shadow behind him. But nothing cut as deep as the moment he stepped in front of me at the VIP elevator, spread his arm across the doorway, and said I didn't belong on the higher floors. He had no idea what would happen when I finally stopped shrinking, and when the screen flashed the call sign he never imagined I carried. I landed at LaGuardia on a late autumn afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and the air tastes faintly metallic, as if the whole city has been steeped in steel. It had been almost a year since I last stepped foot in New York, but the moment I walked out of the jet bridge, it felt as if the city swallowed me right back into its rhythm. No matter how long I stayed away, the place always pulled me into its current like I'd never left. I rolled my small suitcase across the terminal and made my way to the taxi stand. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as I reached the sliding doors. A message from my mother lit up the screen, asking if I'd arrived and reminding me that the family had a fundraising event that evening. She'd saved me a seat, as she always did, trying to bridge the distance between me and the whirlwind that was the Harwell clan. The cab ride into Manhattan moved through familiar transitions, the brief lull of the highway, the slow compression of lanes, and then the sudden eruption of city life. When we crossed the bridge, lights were already flickering on, reflected in the river like scattered shards. I leaned back against the seat, feeling the ache of 3 straight days of meetings still lingering behind my eyes. Washington had been relentless, and the thought of stepping into another crowded room felt heavier than the luggage at my feet. The fundraiser was set on a rooftop along West 57th Street. I'd heard pieces about it through family texts, mostly that my Uncle Mason would be one of the event's highlights. Something about him being involved in a project that had impressed someone somewhere. That was typical for the Harwells. A small success became a story, and a story became a saga. They thrived on gatherings, big or small, where there were hands to shake and glasses to raise. It was a rhythm I'd grown up inside but learned, over time, to observe from a slight distance. I let the city slide past my window streets, thinning into shadows, honking cabs darting like restless birds, pedestrians bundled in coats crossing against the wind. New York had a way of being too loud and too lonely at the same time. A contradiction I understood far too well. I didn't mind returning for brief stretches, but I no longer belonged to the constant blaze of it the way I once did. The taxi slowed as we approached the building. A bright neon sign flashed from the rooftop entrance canopy, casting shifting colors across the sidewalk. I stepped out into a gust of cold air, my breath catching in the sudden chill. I tightened my coat, brushed my hair from my face, and took a moment, just one slow breath, to steady myself. Another night, another Harwell gathering. I walked toward the elevator that would take me up to the rooftop, unaware that the next few days would upend the fragile balance of our family and redefine my place within it in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The rooftop was already alive when I stepped out. Clusters of guests gathered under warm light, their laughter rising and falling with the chill of late autumn air. I spotted my mother near the railing and moved toward her. Her familiar embrace steadied me for a moment, until a voice cut through the crowd with the kind of volume meant to dominate a room. "Mason!" He stood at the center of a small circle, animatedly reenacting some dramatic moment where he supposedly rescued a Federal Reserve team from a major technical breakdown. His hands moved as if he were defusing a bomb. I paused long enough to let it register. He always needed an audience, no matter how much truth was sacrificed to get one. When he finally noticed me, he lifted his champagne and announced that no one should expect anything exciting from me, since my days were spent buried in dull tasks. The guests laughed politely. I smiled back, but his eyes carried something sharper, an unease disguised as arrogance. Before I could step away, he threw an arm around my shoulder and declared he'd be escorting the entire family into the Federal Reserve that weekend. Said he had access almost no one else could get. The words hit me like a cold draft. No one makes promises like that unless they're reckless or lying. A man nearby, likely a coworker, shot him a quick, disapproving glance before turning away. That glance told me everything. Later, when I checked my phone, A triple encrypted notification appeared, clearance sapphire activated. Sync within 72 hours. Above me, the rooftop lights flickered. Mason was boasting about authority he didn't have. And I had just been granted access he had no idea existed. Something beneath the surface was shifting. The next morning, I met my mother at a cafe on Lexington. We talked over coffee, the usual small things, and she mentioned Mason's upcoming tour like it was an exciting family outing. I nodded, letting the conversation move on, though a tight pull formed in my chest. Instinct has a way of warning you before logic catches up. By Saturday, everyone was gathered outside the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, its heavy stone facade towering above us. Mason stood out front, coat buttoned, lanyard on display, positioning himself like someone leading a delegation. At the checkpoint, a guard scanned my ID. His eyes flicked up with a hint of recognition, but before he could say a word, Mason stepped between us and insisted I was with him. The guard closed his mouth, but doubt lingered in his expression. Inside, Mason narrated confidently as he guided the family forward, tossing out explanations that didn't match the building's actual security structure. At the second checkpoint, his badge triggered an odd tone, prompting the staffer to question his access level. Mason brushed it off, claiming he'd been cleared to go farther. The staffer hesitated, then grudgingly allowed us through. When we reached the elevator bay, 2 sets of buttons greeted us: employee access and restricted floors. Mason planted himself before the restricted elevator, hand hovering like he belonged there. He insisted the best part of the tour was above. I stayed still. He wore authority like an accessory. While mine had to stay hidden, something was coming. I could feel the shift in the airs. Inside the Federal Reserve, the air carried that familiar cold metal scent, sharpened by the constant hum of conditioned airflow. I walked in the middle of the family cluster, keeping my eyes on each checkpoint we passed, and every glance exchanged between staff. Mason strode ahead, as if the corridor belonged to him, his voice echoing off the stone walls while he promised that he knew plenty of people upstairs. The confidence in his tone only made the back of my neck tighten. In buildings like this, overconfidence was never a good sign. At the third checkpoint, his badge scanner flickered before displaying a blunt message, "Limited Elvale 1 verified." The guard lifted his head, puzzled, and informed him he was cleared only for public compliance. Mason brushed it off with the kind of casual arrogance he'd perfected, claiming a supervisor had already approved a wider route. The guard stared long enough that I could see the wheels turning. But in the end, he let us pass, not out of respect, but hesitation. It wasn't authority that carried us forward. It was doubt. On the third-floor hallway, Mason abruptly turned toward a passage that led to the 4th floor, a place no consultant should be near. I lowered my voice, reminding him he wasn't authorized up there. He shot me a sharp little smile, the kind meant to put someone back in their place, insisting he'd worked in the building long enough to know where he was going. His tone made it clear he didn't see me as someone who understood the terrain at all. We approached the elevator banks, where public access lifts split off from the operations' internal elevators. Mason gathered the family in front of the restricted side, planting himself before the call button with his chest pushed out, shoulders tight, gaze fixed ahead, as if he belonged among the people who actually worked behind those doors. A nearby guard glanced toward me, clearly preparing to speak, but Mason cut him off with a dismissive assurance that I was with him. The guard hesitated, eyes lingering on me with a flicker of recognition I couldn't ignore. Not curiosity, something closer to acknowledgement. Mason spread his hand in a gesture that resembled a command and told everyone to follow his lead. Excitement rippled through the group as though he were granting them some coveted privilege. I stayed quiet, watching the way he positioned himself, all tense pride and borrowed confidence. Then he turned toward me, voice low and clipped, ordering me to step aside because he supposedly understood this place far better than I did. A Fed employee walked up to unlock a nearby barrier, and when his gaze landed on me, he paused, noticing something, calculating it, respecting it. He said nothing, but the weight of that look told me a line I'd avoided crossing was drawing closer. I knew something was coming. I just didn't yet know how far the shockwave would spread. The operations elevator remained closed, but Mason stood before it like a man directing traffic. The family clustered eagerly around him. I moved closer, deliberately this time, making sure he saw I wasn't lingering behind him anymore. He turned it, voice low and firm, telling me not to complicate things and insisting this wasn't the moment for me to pretend I understood how any of this worked. His eyes held confidence, but behind it, unmistakably, fear. We both knew he had no right to be here. A group of operations staff approached, their pace purposeful. One of them asked who had summoned the elevator, since no guided visits were scheduled for the day. Mason answered with theatrical ease, claiming he had permission. One of the staff exhaled so quietly, I almost missed it. But the sound tightened something deep in me. My younger cousin leaned in, whispering a nervous question about why the staff kept looking at us the way they did. I didn't respond. The truth was too tangled to explain in a hallway full of cameras and silent witnesses. When the panel above the elevator lit with secure authentication required, Mason shot me a smile that felt like a warning. He told me I was about to learn what real privilege looked like. It wasn't a line for the family. It was a challenge aimed squarely at me, as if he needed me to watch him win. But then he scanned his badge. A red flash. A long, sharp tone. Invalid for this sector. Silence thickened the hallway. Mason's eyes darted sideways, searching for an excuse, before he forced a laugh and blamed a system glitch. In a building where every access point was rigorously maintained, the lie landed like a thud. I stepped forward, not to save him, not to escalate, just to take the place I'd stepped away from for years. My hand settled near the sapphire clearance card inside my coat, and a realization settled with it. This was the line I had retreated from over and over, and it was finally time to draw it. The hallway felt unnaturally still as my hand slipped into my coat. Even the constant hum of the ventilation softened, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I could feel every gaze on me, the family's confusion, the Fed employees' alert focus, and Mason's tightening stare. I pulled the card free, a small, matte black rectangle with worn silver edges, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. In this world, the highest authority rarely announced itself in gold or shine. It hid in understatement. I lifted it to the scanner. A low, resonant tone filled the corridor. The panel glowed sapphire. The display shifted in clean, unmistakable text. Access granted operations, override call sign, Haven 9. My family didn't recognize any of it. The employees did. A supervisor appeared from the far end of the hallway, walking with purpose. His posture straightened as he reached me, offering a crisp nod of acknowledgement. Then he turned toward Mason with a look that landed harder than any argument I could have made. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet finality reserved for people who'd been pretending too long. Mason opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stared down at his own badge, blinking as if the plastic might suddenly rewrite itself. Stella whispered my name, her voice shaking not with fear of me, but with the shock of realizing the ground beneath our family had shifted. The supervisor addressed me with calm professionalism, telling me the elevator was ready and he could escort me to any operations floor I needed. I thanked him, stepped inside, and turned back just as the doors began to close. I didn't look at Mason with triumph. There was no victory in this, only truth. Finally standing where it belonged, operations level was quiet in the way only secure floors can be: thick walls, muffled air, every sound absorbed. The supervisor walked me to a small briefing room to finalize the clearance sync. The process efficient and familiar. Mason wasn't allowed anywhere near this floor, and for a moment I thought the confrontation was behind me. But when I returned to the third floor, he was waiting, braced against the wall, hands curled tightly, shoulders rigid. The elevator doors opened, and he moved toward me in a single, strained step. Why one word, sharp and raw? Carrying a tremor he couldn't hide. I met his eyes, really met them for the first time in years. Beneath the bluster, I saw panic fighting to stay contained. He spoke through clenched teeth, insisting I understood how the family saw him, how much weight his role carried. I let the words fall between us without answering. His fear wasn't mine to hold. He struck his palm lightly against the stone wall, voice cracking as he said I shouldn't have scanned that card in front of them, that I'd humiliated him. The tremor of impact traveled through the floor. I answered evenly, telling him I'd only exercised my own clearance, that nothing I did diminished his. He shook his head, eyes reddening, and admitted the truth he'd always shielded behind arrogance, that being near me made him feel small. Hearing it aloud stung in a way I wasn't prepared for, not out of guilt, but out of the years wasted avoiding a wound neither of us named. I told him I never shrank him. He simply refused to see his real size. Footsteps echoed from the corridor. The supervisor stepped into view. Having heard more than enough, his voice was steady as he informed Mason that any conversation involving attempts to exceed authority must be documented. Mason froze, realization breaking fully across his face. There was no more pretending, no more stories to stretch, just the truth, laid bare in a place that allowed no illusions. 3 days later, the fallout arrived in a single email. Mason was notified that his project at the Federal Reserve was being suspended while the institution investigated unauthorized access and potential security breaches. The moment the news spread through the Harwell family, panic ignited like a struck match. Regina called me first, her voice trembling as she demanded to know what I had done to cause this. I hadn't done anything, but I also knew that in some families, truth becomes the easiest weapon to blame. My mother asked to meet me that afternoon. In a small cafe in Soho, she took my hands and told me none of this was on me, that Mason had walked into this mess long before I ever scanned a card. Her words were steady, but the heaviness inside me didn't lift. Breaking someone's illusion, even unintentionally, never feels clean. That night, an old colleague of Mason's called. He couldn't reveal much, but the pauses in his voice told the real story. Mason had been pushing the boundaries of his access for years. People let it slide only because he'd never gotten far. The elevator incident wasn't an accident. It was the point where the system finally stopped looking away. The family split quickly. Some defended Mason and accused me of humiliating him. Others whispered about past moments when his confidence seemed a little too rehearsed. Calls came nonstop: anger, confusion, sympathy. I let it all wash over me, knowing a storm had already broken. Then my mother called again, her voice worn thin. She said there was something I needed to know about my father and about Mason, and immediately I understood the roots of this went far deeper than a single day at the Fed. We sat in her living room, surrounded by soft light and old family photographs. My mother's hands shook slightly as she poured tea. Then she told me the truth. Mason had lived with his whole life. He grew up in your father's shadow. She explained how people used to praise my father, his calmness, his promise, his effortless composure, and how those comparisons followed them from childhood into adulthood. Mason tried 3 times to enter the same programs my father excelled in. He failed each attempt. Every failure carved at him until he started reaching for authority he hadn't earned. Then she looked at me with quiet sorrow. When you grew older, you reminded him of your father, not in what you did, just in who you were, and that made him feel like he'd never measure up. I finally understood Mason never hated me. He hated the version of himself he believed he could never become. A year passed, quiet in ways none of us expected. Mason found work again, not at the Fed, but at a smaller organization where the expectations aligned with who he truly was, rather than who he wanted the world to believe he could be. He drank less, talked less, and for the first time in my life, he listened more. The family shifted with him. The gatherings became simpler, the conversations more grounded. No more embellished stories, no more evenings built around performance. It was as if the air around us finally settled. One early summer evening, Mason invited everyone to dinner in Long Island. The gathering was small, only a handful of relatives seated around a modest backyard table. No stage, no spotlight, just the hum of insects, the clinking of glasses, and the ocean breeze drifting through the screen door. When we raised our glasses, Mason stood. His expression was stripped of the familiar bravado, replaced by something quieter and far more honest. He said he needed to acknowledge something that I hadn't made him smaller. I had only revealed how much he had inflated himself. Silence followed, soft, heavy, and full of recognition. Then he turned to me and thanked me for refusing to shrink just to make him feel taller, and for giving him the space to become someone different than the man he'd been. I nodded, offering no speech in return. Some truths didn't need to be repeated aloud. When the night ended and we walked toward the cars, Mason fell into step beside me, not ahead, not leading. At the Federal Reserve, he had once stood between me and an elevator door. But in the small apartment building that night, when we stepped into the elevator together, he stood at my side at the distance where respect lives. The doors closed gently. No sapphire glow, no override. Just two people who had finally learned the truth about themselves and about each other.